All right, welcome everybody to day 2 of our pop-up institute on Beyond the Future of Work. This is our second public panel, and I'm hugely excited about it. So welcome to our comparative global racial capitalism panel. We are delighted to have with us today 4 cutting-edge scholars working in different disciplines, geographic areas, and time periods. I will introduce them and the idea for the panel in a moment, but first some basic information on the Zoom meeting. I think at this point in the pandemic, I can assume most people are familiar with Zoom, but I just want to explain a few protocols. Okay, we made this a Zoom meeting as opposed to a webinar so that our presenters can see the audience during the Q&A. For now, though, we'd like to ask you to turn your cameras off and please ensure your mics are muted. During the panel, you should feel free to type general comments to everyone in the chat. Since we aren't all good multitaskers, send any questions for the panelists directly to me. If you'd like to ask a question in person, please put an asterisk at the start of the question. Let me know who the question is for and its general topic. If watching from YouTube, enter your questions in the YouTube chat and our student team member will pass them along to me. When all the panelists have finished speaking, please turn your cameras back on for the Q&A. Okay, that's all the housekeeping. Okay, the panel. Our idea for this panel came from the conviction that racial capitalism is a set of histories, a mode of analysis, a method even, essential to any discussion of the past, present, and future of work and workers. It is regrettably a term that does not appear nearly enough in the public discussions of the future of work as we find them. We have assembled a panel who could speak to its various genealogies and contemporary deployments in thinking through this, the future of work, the central topic of our pop-up institute. Speakers who will provoke us to think through the articulations of race and capitalism in the historical making of work and workers, how pre-existing racial categories got mobilized by capitalist expansion, how capitalism in turn racializes the body of workers, and actually how this process is continuing in the present and likely to continue into the future. I'm going to introduce our speakers all at once, and then I've asked them each to speak for 10 to 15 minutes. Then I'll give them some time, but not too much because we want to get to the audience to respond to each other. And then hopefully we'll have half an hour for Q&A at the end. Okay, first up, we're going to hear from Dennis Davis, who's a judge in the High Court of Cape Town, South Africa, and professor at the University of Cape Town. He was appointed by former President Nelson Mandela and served as judge president for the Competition Appeal Court of Cape Town, South Africa's specialized antitrust tribunal. His co-authored and co-edited books span a number of legal topics and include anti-impunity and the human rights agenda, rights and constitutionalism, beyond apartheid, and detention and torture in South Africa. He also hosts Judge for Yourself, a South African television program on current political and economic issues. Next, we'll hear from Arun Kundnani, who writes about racial capitalism and Islamophobia, surveillance and political violence, and Black radical movements. He is the author of The Muslims Are Coming, Islamophobia, Extremism, and the Domestic War on Terror, and The End of Tolerance, Racism in 21st Century Britain, which was selected as a New Statesman Book of the Year. He has written for The Nation, The Guardian, The Washington Post, Vice, and The Intercept. Born in London, he moved to New York in 2010. A former editor of the journal Race and Class, he was miseducated at Cambridge University and holds a PhD from London Metropolitan University. He has been an Open Society Fellow and a Scholar in Residence at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture at the New York Public Library. Our third speaker will be Minkah Maklani, who is the former director of the John L. Warfield Center for African and African American Studies, and associate professor of African and African diaspora studies here at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Maklani works on intellectual history, Black political thought, radical social movements, Caribbean independence, Black power, race and racial identity, and hip hop. He is the author of In the Cause of Freedom, Radical Black Internationalism from Harlem to London, 1917 to 1939, and co-editor of Escape from New York, The New Negro Renaissance Beyond Harlem, with Deverian Baldwin. He is currently working on 2 book projects. The first is called Calypso Conquered the World, C.L.R. James and the Politically Unimaginable in Trinidad, and Words Past the Margin, Black Thought and the Impossible. Finally, we will hear from Vesuki Nesiah, who is Professor of Human Rights and International Law at the Gallatin School at New York University. A founding member of the Third World Approaches to International Law, TWAIL, Vesuki Nesiah researches and writes on the law and politics of international human rights and humanitarianism, with a particular focus on transitional justice and reparations. She is the co-editor of Bandung, Global History and International Law, Critical Pasts and Pending Futures, a project that reflects her interest in critical approaches to international law that find their intellectual and political home in the global South and in the grappling with decolonization. All right, Dennis, the floor is all yours. Take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Neville. And I want to place on record that this is it's an honor to be here, but it's a bad day for me because there's a big football match tonight, which I'm going to have to forgive up the first half, and that's a big sacrifice. But what for racial capitalism, what the hell? Now, you've asked me to address this issue, not the way I did the previous time, which was in a sense to link the work of Cedric Robinson to that of the South African theorist Neville Alexander. But my understanding is my instructions are to concentrate more on Alexander, who's probably not as well known to this audience as perhaps he should be, but certainly had a lot of things to say about racial capitalism in a country which was a quintessentially racial capitalist society. Let me start by saying that the interesting thing for Neville Alexander, who died not that long ago, and also spent something like a decade on Robben Island as a prisoner, political prisoner, roughly at the same time, certainly part of the Mandela period on Robben Island. For him, racial capitalism he used in order to analyze what he considers to be the exceptional character of South Africa. In other words, his argument was that the political economy of white supremacy in South Africa, which differed from the rest of the continent, and in his view of the United States of America, was a particularly exceptional form of racial capitalism, the basis of which I'll come to in a moment. So he, to some considerable extent, eschewed the broader idea of Cedric Robinson, who kind of, as we know, saw racial capitalism much more in terms of a global phenomenon. And so the first proposition that one wants to make about Alexander is that his work was to a large extent concentrated on South Africa. It is also clear that he had a particular view of race, so that in a lecture he gave in 2003, and it's a fairly lengthy quote, but it's an important one for me. He says, "It is common cause in the social sciences today that social as well as individual identities are constructed, not given. The state, or more generally the ruling class in any society, have the paradigmatic prerogative of setting the template on which social identities, including racial identities, are based. Subaltern groups and layers of such society necessarily contest or accept these identities over time. In the South African case, recent examples of this contestation were the categories of Bantu and colored. We must remember, however, that even though they are constructed, social identities seem to have a primordial validity for most individuals, precisely because they're not aware of the historical, social, and political ways in which their identities have been constructed. This is ultimately the psychological explanation for the well-known tenacity of such identities. That they can be deconstructed and reshaped is manifest in the unraveling of the supposedly immutable Afrikaner identity, which is in fact taking place before our eyes right now. At the beginning of the 21st century, It's also a common cause that race is not a valid biological entity. It is, however, equally taken for granted that race is a social reality. Segregationist and apartheid South Africa was, as we know, a byword amongst the nations as a racist society in the 20th century. This was and remains the reason for the sense of hope that was engendered worldwide by the demise of the apartheid regime. There are still many people who hope that the post-apartheid dispensation will show the world that it's possible to open the way towards the realization of the dream of a raceless, perhaps even classless society. Now, that's a fundamental proposition for everything about Alexander. And he was very fond in this particular connection of citing Rosa Luxemburg, in particular the famous passage, the program of visionism becomes not the realization of socialism, but the reform of capitalism, not the suppression of the system of wage labor, but the diminution of exploitation. That is, the suppression of the abuses of capitalism instead of the suppression of capitalism itself. So for him, it was the general acknowledgement of structurally induced poverty as a problem of class and not of race that ought to have informed the moral consciousness of South Africans. He redefined the moral compass of his revolutionary stance of worker liberation in order to address the plight and the needs of those who struggle at the margins of South African society, outside and beyond the formal system and its reach of the free market-driven employment, the unemployed and the unemployable, the impoverished people living in the backyards of South Africa's political economic landscape. And the proposition was Alexander did not need to be persuaded that apartheid South Africa, along the lines of Marxist historians, had an inextricable link between capitalism and race. There was no question about that, in that for him, the entire system of the society was essentially a quintessential idea of South African racial capitalism. The proposition, however, which was particularly interesting, was looking at South Africa post-94. His argument was thus, today, black and white middle classes form what in effect is an alliance against the laboring poor. The crudeness and brutal frankness of this unholy alliance are breathtaking, but in an unintended way, progressive, since thereby South Africans will eventually be forced away from race-centered politics of black or African nationalism to the centrality of class politics. It's interesting, he wrote that in 2002, and in pursuit of the socialist alternative, he often had cause to fear that post-apartheid South Africa could potentially disintegrate and degenerate into dystopia of ethnic, racial conflict and violence if the quest for national identity and unity was trivialized and reduced exclusively to the cultural rhetoric of the rainbow nationalism, which was propagated by Tutu and Mandela. He warned against the dangers of ethnic chauvinism, particularly with the creation of a black middle class of politically connected insiders who invoked this rainbow politics of separate cultural racial identities as the building blocks of a new South Africa and a new project of Renzi. So in spite of his many doubts regarding the neoliberal project of the post-apartheid state, he was realistic enough to acknowledge that the formal introduction of principles of liberal democracy would ensure that the possibility of reversion to white supremacist rule would not necessarily take hold. But the point that he was making was that in a sense, the idea of racial capitalism of the apartheid era was now such that the construction of race and its use by the bourgeoisie in particular were going to do nothing more than reproduce, as it were, a capitalist order which was be more efficacious in the 21st century. As he put it, ownership and control of the commanding heights of the economy have remained substantially in the same hands as during the heyday of apartheid. It is perfectly justifiable to say that what we used to call the apartheid capitalist system has simply given way to the post-apartheid capitalist system. The jargon of those who make the decisions has changed. Everyone has become non-racial and anti-racist. A few thousand black middle-class people have boarded the gravy train and are being wooed into the ranks of the established white elite, but the nature of the state remains fundamentally unchanged. And so the proposition, and I'll end here because I know my time is running short, the proposition is he's saying is that, in effect, what happened in South Africa was a form of use of black labor to reproduce capitalism, which ran its course and which now essentially was transmogrified into a non-racial capitalism. Nonetheless, what he was arguing was that the nature of the society remained pretty much the same as it always was. That, in other words, there could be no reconstruction of the society because what was inherited was a broadly economic framework of a kind that essentially continued to perpetuate an incredible amount of poverty, unemployment, and degradation of the vast majority of the population. Let me say this. He says, only an inveterate denialist or a fool would maintain that the new South Africa, as a political and social entity, is not currently facing one of its deepest crises. Our real concern is the palpable sign of social breakdown all around us, the ever more blatant examples of greed and corruption involving public figures who are expected to be the role models for our youth, the unspeakable abuse of children, of the aged, of the women, the smug dishonesty, indiscipline, and slothfulness of those who are paid to render public services, the lack of respect for life-preserving roles, etc. And so what he was basically saying was that, in a sense, the only alternative to racial capitalism was a reconstructed form of socialism. In his major work, and I'll conclude here, One Azania, One Nation, which was written under the pseudonym No Sizwe, and in fact, I think is referred to by Robinson, or certainly some of the South African literature is, he focuses on the phenomenon of racial capitalism to highlight the race problem from the historical perspective of the white ruling class, backed by a metropolitan capital and defended by white wage earners of all varieties. And the demystification of race was the first step in the process of economic restructuring, a process which ought to acknowledge the historical legacy of social inequality while resisting at the same time the need to redress this legacy through the historical prism of race. And as he says, in a country like South Africa where social relations for generations have been treated as race relations, the need to arrive at a practically illuminating description of the character of these relations is the real socio-economic basis of social inequality, and the real ideological forms in which it's expressed cannot be evaded by those who take upon themselves, or onto whom it is thrust, the political responsibility for planning their post-apartheid, post-color bar society now evolving. In other words, unless you were to come to terms with the legacy of racial capitalism from a reconstructed notion of an economy which was going to eschew the kind of capitalism which was endemic in South Africa, you were going to find people using race for rent-seeking and ultimately a reproduction of the same power relationships, albeit that a small middle class would benefit therefrom. And I'll leave it there now.
Great. Thank you very much, Dennis. Okay, Arun.
Thank you to everyone involved in organizing this. So in the time I have, I am going to ask the question of what happens to our analysis of neoliberalism when we take seriously the insights that have come out of the idea of racial capitalism, right? So, and I'm going to be drawing on an article that's just dropped in the journal Race and Class called The Racial Constitution of Neoliberalism, and an essay of mine called What is Racial Capitalism, which is on my website. And I think one of the organizers posted the link to that in the chat. The concept of racial capitalism, as we should already be aware of just from what Dennis has shared with us, has multiple meanings and is ambiguous. It's quite a slippery term, and so I'm going to lay out just quickly what I think the terms, how I would understand the term. And I'm drawing here on Cedric Robinson and Stuart Hall, both of whom, again, as Dennis kind of pointed to, both of whom were familiar with the initial development of the term in South Africa amongst the South African left, people like Neville Alexander, and who then, as it were, generalized an analysis that had been specific to the South African context to potentially everywhere in the world, but certainly to countries like the US and the UK. So first, I think that the term racial capitalism implies that we accept that capitalism can stably coexist within a single social formation with other modes of production, right? such as plantation slavery, or such as the subsistence economies that were incorporated under colonialism. And that then implies that we have to get rid of any kind of evolutionary idea of capitalism. Can't hold on to the idea that capitalism necessarily seeks the abolition of other modes of production that it confronts. And so we get a picture of capitalism as perhaps always conjoined with non-capitalisms, a capitalism that fails to universalize itself, and therefore one that proliferates multiple forms of relations of production, multiple forms of labor, rather than homogenizing, right? And so for example, wage labor coexisting with slave labor, migrant labor coexisting with non-migrant labor, formal labor coexisting with informal labor, and racism becomes the means by which that differentiation of the workforce is coded and managed, right? That it becomes the terms upon which capitalism narrates and organizes its own failure to universalize a wage labor capital relationship, right? So this explains, this allows us to explain why capitalism is always imbricated with racism, why we can say that capitalism is always racial capitalism. And it enables us to think about the violence of state racism, systems of mass coercion of subordinate workers as the kind of correlates of that. So, whatever the quite, racial prejudice precedes capitalism, but racism under capitalism has to be conceived not just as a kind of archaism or legacy that capitalism inherits, but something that is a material force within the development of social formations, right? And that, I think, helps us to avoid the problem of dual or triple structures of power, where we say that kind of race, class, gender, etc., all kind of separate structures, and then we have a problem of, well, how do we understand their interaction? I think this enables us to think about them as much more closely imbricated. And so we're quite far from the kind of orthodox Marxist idea that racism is primarily a kind of ideological tool for dividing workers, right? Instead, we're saying here that that labor is racially divided materially in fundamental ways, as well as ideologically. So what does that imply for how we understand neoliberalism? So the prevailing analyses, I think, that we have, on the left, over the last few decades that have been politically, incredibly useful in some ways, all have this feature of tending to see neoliberalism's relationship to racism as a matter of inheriting past racial legacies that in fact are seen as being weakened by a kind of neoliberal cosmopolitanism, but not fully defeated, right? So it's this idea that neoliberalism is weakening these histories of racism, but that there's something that's still left behind in the neoliberal period. So, often that's not spelt out explicitly, but it's I think, demonstrably there in as one of the assumptions of the arguments. So for David Harvey, for example, he thinks of race as something that appears as an external kind of cultural factor that is allowed to distort the logic of markets in earlier periods of capitalism, but is stripped away under neoliberalism as social relations are kind of more systematically organized according to market logic in neoliberalism, right? Similarly for Wolfgang Streeck, the kind of racist politics that we've seen, obviously over the last few years, are what he thinks of as a symbolic backlash against the kind of neoliberal cosmopolitanism that has actually otherwise rendered racism kind of anachronistic in this era, right? Coming from a very different kind of disciplinary and theoretical background, someone like Wendy Brown, sees racial inequality as a kind of endurance of the past, which is diminished by the spread of neoliberal rationality. But this in turn generates what she calls a dethroned white identity that lashes out nihilistically and resentfully. And this process, she says, runs against neoliberalism's own aims, producing a raucous populist subjectivity quite different from what the kind of founding neoliberal thinkers like Hayek would have envisaged. So all three of these scholars, in quite different ways, assume or argue that neoliberalism doesn't generate its own distinctive forms of racial domination, right? Rather, if racism is around today, it exists because neoliberalism's defeat of those racial legacies is incomplete, right? And that causes very serious political problems for our movements, because what it means is that the struggle against neoliberalism and the struggle against racism become entirely separated, right? So, and I think what these analyses miss is the ways that neoliberalism does indeed produce its own distinctive structures of racial oppression. And as you know, as the account of racial capitalism that I just gave would predict, neoliberalism actually, in its theory and its practice, conceives of the kind of market order that it wants to generate as a universal order that transcends racial and ethnic differences, but also at the same time as needing to be embedded culturally in racial systems of spatial order, right? And I think that kind of contradiction it runs right through neoliberal thought, and it shapes the kind of distinctive systems of labor, of policing, of bordering that we see under neoliberal capitalism, right? And I think unless we take into account those features of neoliberalism, we won't be able to really mobilize successfully against it. So neoliberalism was certainly founded, as David Harvey argues, as an attempt to restore ruling class power in the face of the mid-20th century strength of organized working classes in Europe and North America. But founding neoliberal intellectuals were equally preoccupied with resisting the mass struggles of the global South and racialized groups in the North that sought redistributions of wealth along anti-colonial and anti-racist lines. So as Quinn Slobodian and Nancy McLean have demonstrated, major schools of neoliberal thought were shaped by the desire to reconstitute racial and colonial domination in the face of the Black and Third World nationalist insurgencies of the 20th century. Neoliberals saw organized labor, anti-colonial nationalism, and the US Black freedom movement as homologous threats. As the early neoliberal Lionel Robbins put it, the mines for the miners and Papua for the Papuans are analytically similar slogans. These racial strands to the founding neoliberal thinkers have been seriously neglected in the scholarship. But if you look at, say, even someone like Friedrich Hayek, who would be normally seen as having a political philosophy, about market fundamentalism. Markets are the fundamental principle. In fact, he then rests that idea of the market on something deeper, which he calls the common cultural tradition, which he sees as native to the West, that markets depend on, and that has to be exported to the rest of the world. And this is why he, for example, believes that, Western culture needs to be protected from immigration from the non-West, even though on his own system that violates his rules of market freedom. Ludwig von Mises believed racial differences meant his ideal market system could only be spread outside the West by force. Wilhelm Röpke argued that market economies depend on a moral infrastructure that thinned in proportion to one's cultural difference from the West. Likewise, Milton Friedman. And we can think about a figure like Enoch Powell, the British politician who's known for mainstreaming a particular kind of popular racism in Britain in the 1960s, but was also the first mainstream politician in Britain to advocate for neoliberalism. So the two went hand in hand, planting the seeds for what would later become Thatcherism. Now, in practice, neoliberalism produces masses of populations who are deemed surplus to neoliberal markets. As Achille Mbembe puts it, they are unable to be exploited at all. They are abandoned subjects, relegated to the role of a superfluous humanity. Capital hardly needs them anymore to function. Kalyan Sanyal calls them the wasteland populations, defined by their being fully excluded from capitalist exploitation, not even able to serve as a kind of reserve army of occasional labor. Now, race, I would say, provides the organizing terms for state practices of global policing of these surplus populations that neoliberalism cannot directly incorporate. So above all, race provides a kind of means of coding and managing the material boundaries between the different forms of labor and surplus under neoliberalism. So between citizen and migrant, between formal and informal, between waged and surplus, between bearers of entitlements and bare life. And this racial ordering of laboring populations at the level of global class relations is violently maintained by neoliberal states and provides the material reality that then enables the spontaneous plausibility of racist ideology as a kind of folk explanation of those material relations. So specifically here, we can talk about, I think, the border. We can talk about discourses of law and order. We can talk about discourses of counterterrorism as the arenas within which that happens ideologically within neoliberalism. So think about the figures of the welfare queens, the Muslim extremist, the illegal immigrant, the narco, the super predator. I mean, this kind of series of racist figures are all in some way point to the idea of the surplus dispossessed. And these become the ways in which the kind of fears and tensions and anxieties generated by neoliberalism are kind of worked through discursively. And they are the spaces within which a racism that's distinctive to the neoliberal era is generated. And of course, the consequence of that is the huge death tolls in the seas and deserts to the south of Europe and the United States, warehousing of millions of refugees in camps conveniently far from the West, the racist projects of policing and mass incarceration, which also are kind of warehousing of surplus populations, the global infrastructures of counterinsurgency in the war on terror, war on drugs, with their death tolls in the millions. All this is inextricable from neoliberalism's market order. So the global policing of Blacks, of migrants, of Muslims, etc., thus meshes with and comes to stand in ideologically for the broader problem of policing neoliberalism's surplus populations within and without the West. So I think so long as prevailing accounts of neoliberalism fail to encompass all this, there'll be a kind of quite stultifying divide between two kinds of left politics. One, which is predominantly white, that has a narrow conception of class struggle and cannot connect to movements against state racism, and the other, predominantly not white, that sees that there is a class struggle in movements against border violence, movements against police violence, against mass incarceration, against a global war on drugs and war on terror, and so on. Movements, in short, that take on the infrastructures of global racial capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arun. Thank you. Okay, Minkah, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. So I was asked to present something drawing off of the article I did in the Boston Review a few months back, actually the title of which I forget. I think it was Cedric Robinson and the Origins of Race, but so I want to just read part of that paper, and because it's part of an evolving piece on Cedric Robinson's political thought, and want to kind of focus in on the two main points that I'm making there. And in part, what would augment the piece is a greater attention to Cedric Robinson's background, his political involvements, his time in England in particular. So as has been noted, his work is credited with popularizing the concept of racial capitalism over the past 20 years, although as Peter Hudson and Dennis have pointed out, that the concept has much longer genealogy. And when looking at Neville Alexander and those debates in South Africa, one of the things that becomes apparent is that they mean much different things in the South African context than what Cedric Robinson is trying to capture. But I would suggest, and this is a point that Robin Kelly made in his new introduction, or forward rather, to the reissue of Black Marxism, that Cedric Robinson only uses racial capitalism a couple of times in that book, and he doesn't actually develop it in a fulsome way. And part of the point that I was making in the piece that I did is that one of the things that has happened in the treatment of Robinson's work and the attention to racial capitalism, and I think in part is because of the capaciousness of the term and what it can do for helping us rethink some of our received radical wisdoms. But that we, in looking at Cedric Robinson's thinking about racial capitalism, we've reached a point of diminished returns if we ignore other elements of his thinking, of his body of work. And part of this is to do with what I think is central to what Robinson is trying to do, both with racial capitalism and his thinking about racialism. And this is to move away from a kind of singular focus on value and the production of value within capitalism. Robinson's focus, drawing, and he's deeply influenced by the work of Oliver Cox, his Foundations of Capitalism and American Leadership, and more importantly, capitalism as a system. Robinson's focus isn't value, but the epistemic frames, ordering principles, and conceptualizations of human association that elaborated modes of difference-making within European political and social life from the 9th century forward. Rather than the nature of value production within capitalism, Robinson is concerned with, quote, an oppression emergent from the immediate determinants of European development in the modern era, which he identifies as racialism. Racialism is defined, according to him, as, quote, the legitimation and corroboration of social organization as natural by reference to the, quote, racial components of its elements. Robinson doesn't see racialism as something uniquely European, but its, quote, appearance and codification during the feudal period into Western conceptions of society. Into Western conceptions of society that was to have important and enduring consequences. For Robinson, racialism is not an ideological apparatus, but a material force that within feudal Europe saturated the social world in which capitalism emerged, its cultural logics, and the intellectual repertoire that explained human affairs, which in turn came to, quote, permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism. Racial capitalism, if we attend to Robinson's thinking around racialism, racial capitalism thus captures the historical elaboration of racialism in the modern era, a particular racial regime quite distinct from, say, the racial regime of ancient Athens. That scholars have really taken up Robinson's conception of racialism is possibly owed to the tendency by many, and myself included, to misread racialism as a neologism for racialization. And I would say that this is the one area where Robinson isn't as precise in the terms that he used, because there is a way that the specter of race is present in his discussion of racialism. What I think he's trying to capture, and this is something that I don't say in the Boston Review piece, but I'm trying to elaborate elsewhere. What I think he's trying to capture is how the mode of thinking about race and differentiation and othering that we have in the 20th and now 21st century, 20th and 21st century, in our theoretical frameworks, that we see that logic, that rationale, that ethical approach to human difference and social order extending backwards. And his use of racialism in a way is a bit anachronistic in that it's taking the language that we use to understand one form of that in the current era, and he reads it backwards. But if we allow for that little bit of imprecision, I would suggest that what is missed in Robinson is his attention to the manner in which European societies legitimize hierarchical relationships as natural, just as the language and structures of race would after 1492. As one of Europe's, quote, most profound terms of order, racialism suffused not only Europe's social consciousness and identities, but its, quote, social structures, forms of property, and modes of production. Indeed, Robinson begins Black Marxism with what he identifies as the first moment of European racialism, which he describes as, quote, the racial ordering of European society from its formative period, which extends into the medieval and feudal ages as blood and racial beliefs and legends. Racialism captures Western society, captures how Western societies have understood and made sense of social stratification and differentiation, a logic that today appears to us as race and racial oppression, the constituting and situating of political groupings within a system of domination that benefits the dominant racial grouping in that system. It is in reading Robinson's work, especially taking Black Marxism and the terms of order together, where he makes his most sustained critique of the political, that his more sustained attempt to grapple with the consequences of the West's rationalization of social hierarchies as natural comes fully into view. Particularly striking is the relay between his conception of racialism and his treatment of the political in the terms of order. And this earlier work in the terms of order is published in 1980, and it issues from his dissertation, which Joshua Meyer, in his work on Cedric Robinson, that is just recently out by Polity Press, points out that it sticks pretty close to his dissertation. But in this work, Robinson defined the political as, quote, an ordering principle arranging the relationship of things and of people within society. Robinson argues that the political came to dominate Western thought as the, quote, primary vehicle for the organization and ordering of the mass society produced by capitalism, end quote, which again, according to Cox, occurred with the transition from feudalism to capitalism in 9th century Venice. As the paradigm that guides how we think about authority, power, and order, for Robinson, the political has the characteristic of being both, quote, an instrument for ordering and that order itself. This is where Robinson departs from the apparent consensus that the political is the necessary, immutable form of human association. Rather, he insists that the political rests upon a mythology of political order as a necessary feature of human association that requires authority, power, and the mechanisms of leadership necessary to exercise that power. Its historical contingency, he suggests, also involves the possibility of replacing it, of elaborating an alternative form of human association. What distinguishes Robinson's discussion of the political is his insistence that it does not merely involve an ensemble of customs, logics, and social relations that presumably maintain political order, which in turn requires certain norms of authority that also involves power as force and violence. Rather, it is his attention to how the political arranges those relationships and distinguishes, quote, the lawful and authorized order of things while itself being the origin of the regulation. Again, in building on Cox's discussion of the ordering of domestic markets, and this is in Cox's Foundations of Capitalism, where he argues that the ordering of domestic markets was done in such a way that workers constituted a national resource with a patriotic duty to work under the direction of their society's leadership or its elite. Now, what I find fascinating in how closely Robinson's discussion of the political maps onto his analysis of racialism is that when reading them alongside one another, we can see Robinson pursue two interrelated features of a single social political history. Put differently, it may be that we can only fully understand Robinson's thinking about racialism by taking account of his thinking about the political. The political is the realm in which hierarchical social order is constituted through practices of difference making. Racialism is the process justifying that order by making those differences natural. Where the political has traditionally framed the history of inter-European racialism, we can see the third period of racialism, which he defines as the incorporation of African, Asian, and peoples of the New World into the world system, emerging from late feudalism and merchant capitalism, this is the extension of the operations of the political beyond the West, what we think of as coloniality. So with this in mind, and this is kind of, the piece is a very detailed way to get at what I think is really necessary, or for myself at least, is really necessary in grappling with Cedric Robinson's work, and that's to reconsider his claim that, quote, Black radicalism is a negation of Western civilization. Robinson is careful to note that he does not mean negation in the Hegelian sense of a dialectical negation. In a 1984 emergency article, and this was a small periodical published in London, which Paul Gilroy was a key figure in the publication of the piece. And his 1984 article is an inventory of contemporary Black politics, which you can find online if you dig a little bit. Robinson draws out what he considers the methodological flaw of Western radical thought's practice of viewing revolutionary movements as, quote, the consequences of processes which mature by producing contradictory fruits. For Robinson, such an approach has the quality of identifying in the prevailing order the source of resolving those contradictions. Historical progress revealing the revolutionary agents who only need to recognize their historical role. In directing our attention to racialism, Robinson suggests that the pursuit of an alternative requires a repertoire whose sources do not issue from the contradictions inherent in capitalism itself, especially if we recognize that the very notion that the structures, conceptual frameworks, ordering principles shaping our contemporary moment are new has the effect of obscuring, if not entirely erasing, their much longer history in European social and political life. If racialism is one of the immediate determinants of European development, it is in thinking with Robinson that we might consider the political as the realm where racialism orders and ranks human difference. Thus, if Black radicalism constitutes a specifically African response to an oppression emergent from the immediate determinants of European development in the modern era and framed by orders of human exploitation woven into the interstices of European social life from the inception of Western civilization, this is Cedric Robinson. If Black radicalism is the specifically African response to that, it is a response that draws on a range of experiences and ways of seeing that are normally viewed as pre-modern, without, or even before reason. So in the piece, I make a point, I'm going to draw to a close, that part of what I think is useful with Robinson's thinking about the political and racialism is that it pushes us to move beyond what we actually can think about, what we can imagine as possible, that he's in a way pushing us to what I'm calling the politically unimaginable. And so we might see Black radicalism as thus highlighting a poetics found in the generative potentialities that come out of the historical contingencies and unpredictability of social interactions. And in this sense, this is what I think is really suggestive about Robinson, where toward the end of Black Marxism, he argues that the historical experiences and the ideas that emerge out of African people's cultures, their frames of thought, and their experiences in the West can serve as a bridge to from the decline of one world order to the eruption of another, and that this is something that is he calls a frightful and a certain space of being, but I would suggest one full of possibilities. Sorry for going over just a little bit, but I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Minkah. Thank you. All right, Vesuki, you get the last word for now. I think you're muted, Vesuki. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I was talking, I guess, to my puppies. But okay.
We need it more than your puppies need it. Okay.
Very good. Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and I'm so glad to participate in this panel. I should say that my talk, unlike my co-panelists, is less about the intellectual history of the concept of racial capitalism. I sort of draw from some of those same sources, but I focus more on how we can better understand the work of international law in enacting a range of diverse racial capitalist governance regimes by unpacking different technologies of international law, such as a public-private distinction or its claim to race-neutral universalism, and so on. And I'm going to talk today mostly about international law and Namibia, but I want to begin with the events of Jerusalem and historic Palestine and Israel. As you may recall, the proximate precipitating incident for the events of the last several weeks was the eviction of, that has been going on for years, but the most proximate thing was the eviction of Palestinian families in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. This was seen by many as part of a process of ethnic cleansing, which has been described by the UN Commission of Experts mandated to situate ethnic cleansing in international humanitarian law as entailing practices that can constitute crimes against humanity and can be assimilated to specific war crimes. And furthermore, that such acts could also fall within the meaning of the Genocide Convention. So genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, in other words, in international law terms, the most serious crimes in the book. In contrast, however, the Israeli government and many of its defenders argue that what was at stake in Sheikh Jarrah was much more mundane. For instance, Professor Avi Bell says that what was really at stake was several properties whose tenants, whose leases had expired. And in a few cases, he says, squatters with no tenancy rights at all, against owner landlords who have successfully won court orders evicting the squatters and overseeing tenants, close quotes. This is not about international humanitarian law, in other words, but about domestic property law. More important, Bell argues that it is the accusation that Israel was involved in an ethnic cleansing operation that is in fact the racist position here. He says critics of Israel, and in this case have adapted the bigoted position, I'm quoting again, that property rights should depend on ethnicity and that Jewish identity should be the grounds for denying legal property rights. Close quotes. So returning repeatedly to the Geneva Conventions, he goes on to say that there's nothing in the Geneva Conventions that require attention to ethnicity in respecting private property rights. Indeed, it is such an approach that would be a violation of international law. These competing narratives, situating ethnic cleansing or racist terror in the intersection of humanitarian discourse in a public universalist register, ethnic cleansing, genocide, crimes against humanity, and so on the one hand, and property claims in a private local register has a long history in international law. Indeed, arguably, this public-private dichotomy was precisely the intersection through which we may situate international law's origin story. Consider, for instance, the work of both Tony Angie and Marty Koskaniemi on Francisco Vitoria's framing of the laws and norms that should govern the Spanish Spanish destruction and dispossession of First Nations people. We see Vitoria offering an argument for native sovereignty that condemned the violence of the conquistadors on humanitarian grounds and advance instead a race-neutral notion of sovereignty that has racial differences internal to it, and naturalizing the private rights of property and contract as entitlements that are distinct from the regime of public law, even if it results in the dispossession of native populations. In this way, the very condemnation of imperial brutality gets tethered to the mirage of a universalist or neutral public international law regime, alongside a private rights regime that it claims to be distinct from, while also seeing its protection as internal to the legitimacy of its public law responsibilities. Thus, settler colonialism and capitalism are intertwined and mutually constitutive in the birthing of a transnational legal regime that can condemn ethnic cleansing while proceeding as if the public and private sphere were two separate and contrasting spheres, in ways that enable territory to be translated into property, exploitation to be translated as private trade. So let me switch against sort of that background to my particular focus in this paper, which is about Namibia and international humanitarian law, beginning with Namibia and the Hague Conventions, and I'll say something later on about the Genocide Conventions too. So this paper explores the afterlives of those twin trajectories of settler colonialism and capitalism, in international law, with particular attention to the Hague Conventions. In particular, I want to look at how these twin trajectories played out in Namibia in the late 1800s and then sort of the early 1900s. While colonization came late in Namibia, then called German Southwest Africa, its brutalities unfolded hard and fast. Law was a central weapon in the colonizing process, with private traders and emissaries of the German government negotiating treaties with local chiefs over land rights and weaponry. The plot lines of what ensued is familiar from other colonial theaters. Trading clauses were aimed at dispossession and debt, and protection clauses aimed to defraud and divide local communities, including the Herero and Nama. With land as collateral and bounty, debt and security became weaponized, and colonial lawfare made way for racialized and highly militarized governance policies that unleashed a series of brutal assaults on local communities that coupled the appropriation of land with military attacks, aggressively asserting colonial authority. Notions of racial expansion and racial superiority were fused with these encounters as part animating rationale and part legitimizing rationalization. Thus, in the same period, we saw early articulations of the notion of Lebensraum. I'm probably completely brutalizing my German, leaving space that spoke of the manifest destiny of the German people through an ever-expansive settler colonial agenda. The Herero and Nama resisted, they organized and negotiated, they strategized and fought back. They turned to political maneuvers, treaty negotiations, and violent resistance. Their resistance was met by large-scale ethnic cleansing projects, or what many describe as the first genocides of the 20th century. So in 1804, just 20 years after the Berlin Conference had awarded Namibia to Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II's emissary, General Van Trotha, began issuing extermination orders and implemented a counterinsurgency plan that resulted in the killing of over 75% of the Herero and 50% of the Nama in less than 4 years. The Hague Conventions were drafted even while the German extermination orders were being implemented, really in the very same historical minute, as it were. They outlined the legal ambit of belligerent occupation and explicitly barred collective punishment. The conventions also made provision for the recognition of legitimate resistance by those belligerently occupied. The convention cemented distinctions that remain at the heart of international humanitarian law, distinctions between times of war and times of peace, between combatants and civilians, between the seizure of property for military objectives and pillage that is not justified by those objectives. However, the convention did not speak to the Herero and Nama resistance. These were Germany's internal law and order problems. Rather, the Hague Convention's notion of belligerent occupation made a pivotal distinction between places of war and places of conquest. In fact, it was not the abuses of colonization, but resistance to colonization that was rendered illegal. Anti-colonial resistance was, in Van Trotha's words, terrorism. Much of this, when you're reading this at the very moment of, in some sense, listening to Israel talk about what was happening over the last few weeks, it's the same language of German colonialism. In the case of both genocides, the killings implemented a legal order, itself the result of an official policy of maintaining the authority of the colonizing power in response to armed resistance that was condemned on humanitarian grounds. The treaty lawfare mopped up anything not already covered by the larger writ recognized by the Berlin Conference regarding sovereign authority over the continent. General Van Trotha had in fact been appointed as commander-in-chief of German Southwest Africa on the basis of his success in suppressing the Boxer Rebellion in China on behalf of the Eight-Nation Alliance. Thus, Van Trotha undertook his duties empowered by German legal authority, but also with wider European support for the methods undertaken in response to violent resistance in the name of the rule of law. With colonialism, whiteness becomes a species of property that begets more property by converting land into commodity through a property and contract regime that are coded as domestic. The basic contours are well captured by how Cheryl Harris describes the core characteristics of the wages of whiteness in the American legal architecture. She says, open quotes, the legal legitimation of expectations of power and control that enshrine the status quo as a neutral baseline while masking the maintenance of white privilege and domination, close quote. But typically we look to areas such as international trade law to better understand how global economic injustices get reproduced and exacerbated. There's profit in also exploring how international humanitarian law has enshrined the status quo from the moment of the Hague Conventions on. The imperatives of humanitarian conquest inflected what Fassin calls humanitarian reason with its epistemic and political investments and its material and ideational profit. The colonizer-colonized distinction trumped the civilian-combatant distinction and exposed the radical instability of the principles defining the notion of the human. The colonizer seldom thought he had reached the threshold of disproportionality in violence against the colonized, be it in destruction of the colonial body or exceeded permissible military objectives in the appropriation of colonial territory. Instead, the civilizing mission rendered the colonized perennially vulnerable. The Hague Conventions do work both by claiming jurisdiction and by disavowing jurisdiction. The work of disavowal is in this sense the work of licensing, of enabling, dramatically underscored by the fact that the conventions being drafted at the very historical moment that ethnic cleansing and land dispossession were being undertaken on a dramatic scale in Namibia. The convention's indifference becomes in that sense a conventional difference, part of the enabling legal architecture that codes these as not in contradiction with what Cheryl has described as the baseline legal expectations of the regime of property and contract that emerge in international law. These baseline expectations are reinforced again and again, including just a little over a decade later at the Versailles Peace Conference, where the genocide against the Herero and Nama get glossed over as mandate responsibilities are passed on to South Africa. The work of IHL is not only through such marked disavowal, but also through its explicit incorporation into the framework of humanitarian protection as expressed through the language of civilization, explicitly invoked in the preambles to both the Hague Convention and the Genocide Convention. As Dina Zawala has recently argued, the notion of civilization was developed through notions of biology and progress that themselves advanced a racial capitalist project in many iterations, including in Namibia's incarnation as Southwest Africa from the mandate period on where it offered a telling stage for the South African governance mechanisms of land dispossession, labor exploitation, and racial hierarchies. National liberation struggles such as that of the Herero and Nama challenged two dimensions of IHL. Firstly, they contested the co-IHL distinction between civilian and combatant and the attendant zoning of the former into the realm of non-violence normalcy and the latter into the realm of violence and conflicts, since reframing normalcy as violent conflict as in fact became part of the point of the struggle. And secondly, they contested the distinction between rules that apply to international wars and non-international wars, since treating the colonizer external to the colonized nation is in fact also the whole point of the struggle. How much time do I have, Neville, or am I already in violation? 5 minutes. Okay.
5 minutes.
If I exceed that, or you want me to shut up, I can stop any moment. So if you're free to interrupt.
Okay, I will do this when.
Okay, I'm not looking at you. I'm looking at my text.
Okay.
So just
right.
interrupt me.
Okay. All right, Vesuki, I will.
Okay. So I know my time is limited. So perhaps the last point I want to make is about how the Genocide Convention and Geneva Conventions are read today in relation to the history of dispossession, labor exploitation, and destruction that German colonialism brought to the Herero and Nama. There is, as many of you may know, a burgeoning feed of scholarship that seeks to decolonize the 1948 Genocide Convention and the ways in which particular investments in whiteness have been baked into trauma and memory studies and the epistemic and justice claims inflecting and shaping the legal recognition of genocide and claims of reparations from people like the Herero and the Nama. Moreover, as many Palestinian scholars have pointed out, this is most marked in terms of which genocides the German government takes responsibility for and which it doesn't. Its marked refusal of reparation claims for its colonial genocides and the material stakes in terms of land distribution, labor exploitation, and the political economy of contemporary Namibia is especially striking about the work of the Genocide Convention and the rationalized logics that infuse the laws and norms of human rights and humanitarianism today. With the eyes on violence in Southern Africa, thinking especially of the British Boer War in that context, Hannah Arendt, in her reflections on violence, worries about what she describes as the boomerang effect of violence in the colonies back in Europe. And indeed, the boomerang between genocidal violence against the Herero and Nama and genocidal violence against the Jews and Roma are especially striking. Over the half century that followed the violence against the Herero and Nama, it boomeranged in Europe in both direct and less direct ways. They have the strategies of concentration camps, starvation, and slave labor inaugurated in Swakopmund and Shark Island that traveled back to Germany to be part of the Nazi arsenal of extermination. They have the personal links of state functionaries like Göring and Van Epp, whose colonial bureaucratic experience then fed back in different ways into the SS bureaucracy and governance practices structured on racial differentiation. There was a disciplinary formation of eugenics, phenology, and other scientific racisms that harvested skulls, experimented on humans, and traded in skeletons and ever more detailed theories of race and racial difference. These were the intertwined strategies of racial distinction and land appropriation captured in the notion of Lebensraum, living space, that we referred to earlier. Lebensraum played a central role in Nazi ideology in propelling expansion into Poland, Hungary, and further east. Yet this notion's particular German provenance is most pointed only in the extent to which the strategy of racialized appropriation and dispossession reached across Europe. This resonated with colonial land policy in Namibia and elsewhere, the core thrust of the military, legal, and economic assault to create and extend racialized living space is central to perhaps to all settler colonial projects from the Americas onwards. Arguably, it has its contemporary corollaries in both the erection of walls to fortify space against racialized others, as well as in settler colonial expansion of today from Standing Rock to Jerusalem. Moreover, in all of these cases, one repeating trope is that the public-private distinction, as it manifests in international law, is jurisdictional claims over sovereignty and jurisdictional disavows over the realm of property and market relations that it codes as private.
Okay, Vesuki.
Stop.
Stop.
Okay.
You've given us given us so much.
No, I'll stop.
All right, I'm going to ask everybody else to please turn their cameras back on so the panelists can see you. And wow, there's so much in these papers. I'm struggling to kind of put them together. I have one slightly cheeky question for the panel, because in a way I didn't ask you to explicitly think about this. But our topic is the future of work. And I think there's been very interesting, I mean, I think what the papers have in common is the attempt to think the political and governance in relation to, let's say, borrowing Vesuki's language, land dispossession and labor exploitation, and actually the sort of structural logics of violence, of which racism is one of the most important. So what do you think the implications, this is just a general question for the panel, what do you think the implications of your particular analysis is for questions of labor in 2021? I know that's hugely general because you're working in very different contexts. Okay, so that's just one thing. Or if you would just like to respond to anything one of your fellow panelists said, I think that would also be a good way of getting the conversation going, whichever strategy you prefer. And we've muted everybody, so don't forget to unmute yourselves before you speak.
I'll take a stab at it with the admission that I didn't quite think through the question of the future of work in relationship to the presentation. But if there's one element of what Robinson is after, and one that I think might be useful, is maybe a need to really rethink how work or labor as categories are factoring into the political impulse behind the question of the future of work. And I think this has been taken up in different kinds of ways. One of the most suggestive, though I don't necessarily agree with it in total, is that I've seen is from Shauna Jackson in her work, Creole Indigeneity, where it's calling into question the primacy of labor as a normative category within Western political thought, and then how that, in the particular case that she's looking at, labor or the work that the enslaved did became a basis for claims to land or claims to belonging or indigeneity in Caribbean post-colonial societies. I don't necessarily follow the argument that she's making all the way, but I think there is something suggestive about needing to interrogate why the different categories that we operate from, why we presume them to be suggestive and capacious in that regard. And I think that's what Robinson is trying to get at with the political in some ways. And I would suggest that it may have, there may be something productive for us to really get at, because I think that's not, it's maybe easy to assume that when we're talking about work, we're talking about those who are exploited or who experience extreme levels of exploitation, or those who are excluded from work, which may raise questions about how it functions as a category for organizing politically or organizing social movements. So that's a long-winded, roundabout way of trying to answer a question I hadn't thought about in detail until you just posed.
Thank you, Minkah. Does anyone else on the panel? We've got 15 minutes left, so I want to leave some time for the audience. Does anyone else on the panel want to respond, or shall we go to the Q&A?
I'll make a comment, Neville. It strikes me that, one of the things about Robinson, which attracted me when I read his work, was, of course, this idea of the paradox between trying to reconceive your society through concepts which ultimately pressed you in the first place, the tension between kind of reconceptualization, how do you go about doing it? And it seemed to me that's what Alexander was trying to do in many ways, was try to negotiate a kind of new vocabulary which was not going to either be class reductionist or race essentialist. And in relation to your question, I mean, bluntly, what he's saying is that within a capitalist system, you will get the kind of neoliberal or variations of that which Arun was talking about. It's inevitable. And that therefore, if you're going to reconceive of theories of work, if you're going to start to deal with the pathology, which kind of motivates one to deal with this, ultimately the economic structure, again, the favorite comment that he made, which I quoted from Luxembourg, you can do Band-Aid, but that's as far as you're going to go. And the question is, how do you think yourself through a totally reconstructed system? Because if you don't, capitalism inherently will always utterly utilize categories for its own advantage. And the weird thing about South Africa is that it even uses race as the basis for forms of rent seeking, whilst throwing the poor, who happen to be black, I might add, onto the rubbish heap of history at the same time. That was his concern, which is an incredibly intricate argument. But it does seem to me that it's a challenge for us to think through that and beyond that. And I think that's why for me, he was such an invigorating thinker.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Audience members, put questions in the chat, raise your hand. Or if I don't see you, you can also just unmute yourself and yell. I will listen.
I mean, just a small point, perhaps, Neville, while people are thinking about questions, is that, well, one is just about sort of the intellectual backdrop of thinking about racial capitalism, that, one of the, so for many of us, it was through Cedric Robinson and the way in which Robin Kelly and others have sort of opened up his work to us. But once you sort of in some sense think racial, then you sort of see it everywhere as well. So like when I was looking at this, the relationship between, say, racialized economic exploitation in Namibia and then Nazi Germany in the middle of the century, and thinking about Arendt speaking about this boomerang, then you read Nesiah speaking about boomerang, and he has a completely racial capitalist vision about the boomerang, unlike Arendt, who is worried that the economic is displacing the political. Nesiah then thinks of it as sort of internal, completely internal to it, and that that's the so. So I just want to also say that there is, in some sense, that there's much to explore, and certainly this maybe I'm just fetishizing the personal. Many more that in terms of the intellectual trajectories of racial capitalism, many more strands to unpack and marry and so on in a way that's interesting and perhaps valuable. So.
Maybe I'll come in as we, I think, in case while we wait for any other questions from the audience. But someone said they'd like to hear my response as well to the question, Neville. So I guess for me the question of the future of work is the way that I would come at it is to say that we used to have an idea that over time labor would become more and more like a certain model that prevailed in Europe in the mid 20th century, and that was just the natural trajectory of how capitalism unfolded. And what we get, I think, from the argument about racial capitalism is that simply isn't true, and therefore the politics of labor is not going to be entirely about the dialectic between wage labor on that model and capital. As Minkah pointed to as well, it's going to be about kinds of struggle that emerge from outside of that relationship, right? And what that means is what we're seeing at the moment is a massive, it's the opposite of what we expected. It's the contraction of, hardly anyone has that relationship now, right? And people would love to have that relationship of being exploited in the mid 20th century European way, of working in a kind of industrial job of that form. And so what we're seeing, I think, in the future is going to be more and more economies that have to be created by people outside of the formal economy in order to find some way of living and caring for each other. And and that, I think Cedric's work, Stuart Hall's work, Neville Alexander's work, in different ways, all help us to make sense of what that looks like in that space of the surplus, right? And the way that has happened until now, like the question of the relationship of that surplus space to what you might call the mainstream of capitalism, like what that's looked like until now has been a kind of incorporation at one remove. The kind of apartheid was, South African apartheid was one way of doing that. Migrant labor is another way of doing that, usually, often. But and the whole infrastructure of kind of policing, coupled with the whole logic of development that's all in different ways trying to keep that the potential of some of an exit from capitalism from emerging in the surplus space, right? There's a whole infrastructure arranged to try and prevent that exit, but it's becoming harder and harder, I think. And the resources are less and less there to do that. And so I think the future is as well as the clash, the good old fashioned class struggle clash in a country like the United States, or in countries like Europe. Labor versus capital is not by any means an old story in that old fashioned sense. there's going to be the emergence of these alternative economies, right, more and more. And I think that's one of the most interesting things, where labor is just conceived in completely different ways. And perhaps that connects a little with what Minkah was just speaking about in the context of indigeneity in the Caribbean.
Okay, there's Anne Lewis has another question in the chat. I think it's a difficult one if anyone wants to. I mean, what are the possibilities for solidarity across? I mean, I kind of feel like we're back in the crisis of the Second International, except with a huge reserve army of labor that's no longer a reserve army of labor. It's just disposable people. But okay, how might we exit? Okay, I'm remembering a meeting we had this morning. What might be grounds for optimism? Because I mean, the vision in my head from this is kind of apocalyptic and dystopian. That actually the shrinking possibilities for a viable life, we're in bare life. So Arun, you talked a little bit about sort of things emerging in that surplus, even as capitalism and as racial capitalism fails to police those boundaries. Can you have an imagine, like what sorts of things? What kinds of imaginings are happening there? Or where might we look for them?
I mean, I'm not the optimistic person normally in life generally. I'm the guy in the corner, you know, kind of saying depressing things usually, but so it's weird that it's my fault to me, but you know, I don't know that I can say much about you know, about kind of concrete examples that we can point to here, but I would say I mean, certainly, you know, I mean, in the United States, you would point to the examples around mutual aid and that kind of, you know, that kind of anarchist tradition that's taken on new forms in the context of COVID. I mean, there's similar things happening everywhere, and there's all kinds of problems with that. But what it points to is that, you know, people are not. I mean, I think it's part of our basic constitution as human beings that we find new ways to create mutuality between us when the existing structures collapse, and we're living in a time where exactly that seems to me to be happening, and I suppose I have an old-fashioned faith in humanity is what I've just realized from saying that, but I would stand by that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to hold on to that, but it does seem to, look, I don't think the kind of an analytic that Neville Alexander developed is going to happen in my lifetime, frankly. And although I'm old, I hope to live a little while. And in fact, the question, interesting enough, about the possibility of new solidarity in multinational workers and the oppressed is an interesting one. Because if you take my own country, South Africa, the lack of solidarity between the poor and the public service sector workers, who are the most highly paid workers in the country and who want 15% increases at the time when government is actually battling to provide social grants for about 30 million, is a fascinating reflection of just what happens. But I do think that in relation to your faith in humanity, that I do think, and one of the things that's fascinated me recently is being on a series of webinars with heterodox economists. We kind of are thinking that there is a bit of an inflection point in their field, and that the idea of sort of efficiency and, you know, various forms of market fundamentalism have run into serious trouble in the COVID period. And there is an inflection point here. We can go a more protectionist narrow route, but there is also the possibility of something broader. And frankly, that does depend on organization of all kinds. So the point, Neville, is that even in relation to the question that Anne Lewis asked, and which I sort of, from a South African point of view, answered rather gloomily, I do think that there are some possibilities one shouldn't, this is not an inevitable situation on any particular thing. And there is an inflection point, and it has fascinated me, how many economists are revisiting their own discipline by saying we've taken us down an awfully oppressed cul-de-sac. And they have to rethink the discipline because we have to rethink the problematic. So there is work to be done, but it's not entirely gloomy work.
Dan, I saw you had a hand raised. But I see it lowered. Where are you with the question?
Oh, it wasn't really a question. It was just a comment in respect of your question about where we might find optimism. I mean,
give us hope.
I'm the person who's been called the dark side of dark.
Come on.
No, but what I was going to say is actually that part of the reason that we see it as apocalyptic is because we have a particular idea about what it means to live,
Yes.
and what we need to live. That's very much framed by capitalist success in the West. And so, in a certain sense, the question then becomes, are there new social forms of provisioning support, connection, and so forth that aren't focused primarily on growth, but are primarily focused on human connection, meaningfulness, inclusion, participation. And I think people are going to have to invent those things, whether because of the apocalypse of climate change or whatever, and they're already trying and starting to invent those things. And so I sort of, in my faith in humanity, is just that little islands of possibility are going to start bubbling up, and we just might have to, to pick up on Minkah's idea of, thinking the impossible, we might just have to start imagining a whole different way of being. How much we need, what we, I mean, that is, and I know that sounds utopian, but I think it's inevitable in lots of ways. And so, but I see that as hopeful, because I do have a fundamental faith in humans' ability to come back from disaster. I mean, all the stories that we heard today, Vesuki started out in Namibia, and then you think, but we're still here, they're still here. And that's worth remembering.
Trouble is their heroes aren't.
No, I know.
Okay, we're out of time, but I just want to make an announcement, and then Vesuki, I saw a hand. Was that a hand? Okay, I'm going to give Vesuki the last word. Okay, we have a session at 3 o'clock called Let's Keep Talking. It's a completely informal session. It's on the program. I will be there if anyone wants to come and continue this conversation or a conversation from yesterday. So I just wanted to tell you about that. It's 3 to 4. It's on the program. No obligation, but if you feel so inspired and you want to keep talking, some of us will be there. Okay, Vesuki.
Yeah,
I was going to say, put us out of our misery. Take it or wrap it up. Say whatever you want to say.
Yes. No, I'm not sure whether it put us out of our misery. I mean, I think we're not going to see positive signs of the kind that we looked for in the past. However, like as Dan said, that maybe there are sort of little islands of hope. I mean, certainly, I'm just preoccupied with what's been happening in Palestine and Israel. So, I mean, there are certainly, you find lots of, we can't depend on the global, we need to build our own things. And people, there's a whole sense of community-based assistance, and not unlike the mutual aid thing that Arun referenced, that comes out of people's disillusionment in the larger context. I mean, I think the other positive thing, which is both the positive and negative thing, is that people are, often, even on labor issues, organizing around precarity. So on the fact of people being vulnerable, and I think and so we've seen, of course, there's much to be hopeful for. If you look at social movements over the last few years, there's been organizing of the kind that we hadn't seen, say, 10, 15 years ago. And often it's about a mutual recognition of that precarity, and that precarity is it's a condition for the for the future. I mean, it's a condition that's going to be with us, but it's also apparently not a condition that's paralyzing, but in fact a condition that gets people onto the streets. So,
all right, let's thank our, I don't know, you can clap or you can do your clap icon. Let's thank our panelists.
Thank you.
This was really terrific. It was difficult and provocative, and I'm going to be thinking about these issues for a long time. So thank you very much and keep coming.